Okay, so the next thing that we'll want to do is we'll want to raise this road slightly. And if this was on a completely flat surface, we could do it with the push-pull tool inside of SketchUp. But because it's on a curved surface, that's unfortunately impossible. But there's a plugin that exists which would allow us to do that, which leads me to discuss plugins and how they work for SketchUp. So as far as extensions are concerned, sometimes also called plugins, the two words are pretty much interchangeable. As far as extensions are concerned inside of SketchUp, the rule of thumb is the more extensions that you have, the lower the software stability. And because we want our software to be stable, but we also want to have a reasonable, set of tools to do the operations that we want to do, we can actually separate SketchUp extensions into 3 categories. The reason it's useful to do that is because not all of them need to be turned on at the same time. So the first category is tools, and tools are plugins that focus on adding tools and actions that you can use to make your model. So, extra tools for curves and all of that stuff. The second category is utilities. So utilities are plugins that allow us to import and export specific file formats, and also sometimes, rework some of the geometry that you already have in your model. And the last category is rendering plugins. So rendering plugins are usually dedicated to working on materials, as well as preparing your model to render either inside of SketchUp or in an external rendering program. So as far as tools are concerned, they can be on most of the time. And the reason I say most is because sometimes they will cause conflicts with rendering plugins. So if you're rendering your model and you see that there's some things don't quite work when you try to adjust your model using tool plugins, you can turn them off and resort to using only SketchUp default tools. But most of the time, they shouldn't cause any conflicts. As far as utilities are concerned, you can leave them always on because they usually only cause crashes when they are used, by themselves. They don't really affect how other things work in SketchUp, so it's safe to keep them on. Now, what's really important is rendering plugins. Rendering plugins should only be turned on when you are actually using them. That's extremely important. Some of the rendering plugins have enormous impacts on how the program calculates geometry, so they should only be used when you're actually rendering the model. So I'm going to provide you with a list of the extensions that I use when working on my architectural models, and these are also the extensions that we'll be using in this course. So in the tools category, we have the tools by Fredo. So Curvyloft, Joint Push-Pull, and Fredo Scale. libfredo is a library plugin that's required to run the 3 other Fredo plugins. Then we have the Sketchucation Extension Store plugin, which is required to install some of these plugins. So I'm going to discuss that in more detail slightly later. In the utilities category, we have Point Gadget version 2, which allows us to import .csv terrain files. I also use SimLab FBX importer. It's pretty rare that you'll get to use it, and it's a paid plugin, so I don't, it's not a must-have in my category. We won't be using it in this course too, but it's if you ever need to import FBX files, I find that this is the better one of the FBX importers that are available out there. I also use OBJ importer by TIG. And in the rendering category, right now I'm using LuxRender. I used to work with Thea, but right now that's the LuxRender is what I use to render my models. So the plugins that have a orange dot next to them are plugins that you can only download from the Sketchucation website. And they're free, but you do need to create an account on the Sketchucation website to, first of all, install their extension, and then to download these and install these plugins. So there are 2 libraries inside of SketchUp that from where you can download plugins from. So there's the SketchUp extension library, the official one, and there's the Sketchucation extension library. And both require you to create an account. and both contain mostly free plugins. So I would recommend registering in both libraries and installing the Sketchucation Extension Store plugin. Alright, so back to our model. Now that I've sort of briefly introduced all the plugins that we're going to be using, I'm just going to go ahead and enable them in View, Toolbars. I'm going to enable Curvy Loft, Extension Store from Sketchucation, Fredo Scale, Fredo Joint Push Pull, and yeah, you can see that this is the S2 Lux is the Lux render toolbar, but since we're not going to be rendering, I'm not going to touch this. I'm going to stay away from this because it really does. For some reason, rendering plugins cause SketchUp to crash more than anything else. I'm not going to enable this now. I'm going to close this. Now this extra space that we had here is going to come in handy, so I'm going to start placing my stuff here. And I guess these two can stay down. All right, so now let's get back to our terrain. If I enter this component here and I select the road, you'll see that if I try to use the regular push tool, it's going to tell me that I cannot push pull a curved or smooth surface. So what I'm going to do is in my Fredo joint push pull, I'm going to use the J option. So all of these are different versions of the push-pull tool. So I'm gonna go through other options in detail when we're actually gonna use them. But for now, let's just stick with the first one. So you can see there's an additional options bar that appears when I select that. And I'm gonna select any of the triangular faces on this curved surface and start, extruding it. And it works exactly as the push-pull in SketchUp in that you can type an extruding dimension. So I'm going to type 6 inches, and I'm going to press enter afterwards. And now it's going to start, calculating geometry. So we'll just let it do that. And there you go. So it successfully extruded a curved surface. And as you can see, it did a pretty damn good job at it too. There aren't any broken geometry pieces or anything like that. So this is just going to place the road on a slightly higher level, which I like to have because it sort of mimics the asphalt and is going to be useful later on when we're going to be making the driveway for the house. So that's what the joint push-pull tool is. All right, so in this module, we imported and adjusted the terrain provided by a surveyor. So in particular, we imported a .dxf terrain into SketchUp. We created a 3D mesh from a set of lines in that terrain. We adjusted the newly created mesh around the corners, repositioned the tree markers provided by the surveyor. We discussed plugins, and we recolored the terrain and extruded the road. In the next module, we will be covering components.